foils. I'm Brooks Benton.
I'm DJ Akers.
And I'm Stan Singh.
And we're here to talk about James Baldwin and how he defied literary convention to break social convention.
So before we talk more about our ideas and our presentation, let's take a look at who James Baldwin was. He was a brilliant essayist and author, both prior to and during the Civil Rights Movement. A great friend of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Medgar Evers. His work basically contained a vision that he had for the Civil Rights Movement that stemmed from his experiences in life. So as you can see over here, he was born in Harlem in New York City, and then during the early part of his career, he moved to Paris to escape the racial persecution that he felt was being levied upon him in America at that time. While he was in Paris, he worked on numerous essays, articles, and novels that all contained his visions and are going to be explored further in the presentation. Eventually, he came back to America to be a civil rights activist and a proponent for the disenfranchised, namely the African American community in America at the time. Eventually, he died in Paris, France in 1987. So what are we going to discuss today? What is our presentation about? We believe that James Baldwin's work challenges white America's image of itself as innocent, because it very beautifully exposes the dark underbelly of white American society at that time.
Now, this idea of white innocence is important. It's basically the idea that white America is not responsible for changing what's going on in the black community. It's the idea that white people are unaware of the injustices that face black people. And if you believe this, therefore, the civil rights movement has nothing to be based on, which therefore means that the civil rights movement is a whole lot about nothing, and the white community can describe that as being inappropriate and unacceptable. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit later. This is an important debate between James Baldwin and Professor Paul Weiss, but Professor Paul Weiss exhibits this white innocence. He says that black people have no sort of structural reason that they can't get ahead, and that there is nothing separating blacks and whites. And that's the idea of the white innocence. It's very important. It's the idea that James Baldwin tries to argue against.
Now before we move on, all of these images are not here to offend anyone. They're simply our attempt to hold a mirror up to the media of the time and to show the thin veneer of white innocence, this illusion that existed in media at that time and therefore in the public consciousness. Because all of us know very well that media plays an integral part in our lives. It hypnotizes us, it mesmerizes us, and it shapes our public consciousness as a community. Now at that time we can see that these advertisements, the portrayal of black men in the media as being in a sort of kind-hearted coexistence with the white people who subjugate them being okay and accepting of them having white masters, of them being in service to their white rulers to an extent, is something that's portrayed as a very innocent and obvious thing in that time. And every black face that you see in these advertisements is shown as being happy, is shown as being accepting of this state, is shown as thinking that this state is natural. And some of this even persists to this day, where you can see the Nivea ad talking about white is purity. And these kind of subtle references to white innocence, to this idea of white America being innocent of its crimes, is what perpetuated an illusion that James Baldwin was trying to break down.
Now, this is the great misconception. This is the biggest problem that we have, that Baldwin faced, is that the separate but equal ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson was equal as seen by the white community, when it inherently was not. James Baldwin tried to prove that everything was not fine, everything was not equal within America, and that the only place that was fine and equal was white America. And this is demonstrated by the quote we have on screen from Baldwin. And it is he is saying that white America sees that only their brothers are white. They don't acknowledge the black community living within America, and they don't see any problems that are occurring within that community. Now, in historical context, this is completely false. We can see that from the recorded amount of lynchings that were actually documented, there are over 3,000 of them. And this is incredibly violent and in opposition to white America seeing itself as not doing any harm, as the status quo being fine. We can even see that with the Plessy versus Ferguson case that separate but equal is inherently unequal when you look at the status of the separation. For the black community, everything is underfunded, poorly maintained, and in a deteriorating state, while the white community has the priority. Now, this photo, I would care to draw your attention to it, and it's kind of personal for me because I didn't realize that this was from my hometown. This photo right here is from where I live in Georgia. I would pass this place every day I went to work. It's a very public place in town, and in the photo you can see a little cart. That's the mail cart over by the train station. They would haul the mail up for people to come get it, and they hung a man up there. People that I knew, their ancestors, even my ancestors, could be responsible for this. And in white innocence and white ignorance, this was believed to be okay. This is the way things were. White justice is just how it is, and it is okay to take another man's life. And this is just very shocking that I would drive past this every day. Now, James Baldwin saw this incongruity. He saw that white America was believing itself to not have any problems because it didn't, but it was forcing it upon the black community. And he talks about this in one of his works and how he compares it to a plight that white America will understand. The ghettos of Nazi Germany, which is radical, but it is honestly the truth because white America, much like Germany of World War II, segregated and concentrated a group of people within a certain area of a city. It's in Harlem for the black community of America. They grouped them up, they tried to control them by keeping them in one place and limiting their possibilities for growth. And it's a very similar plight, and Baldwin hopes that with comparing the black community to the Jewish community, that the white America will take notice, they will understand the parallel, because this is a plight that they felt for.
James Baldwin uses characters a lot in his books to describe the tension between whites and blacks in the United States and their relationship. One important way he does this is a dichotomy between race and sex. James Baldwin was homosexual, and the reason I bring this up is because it's a significant theme in at least one of his books, actually a couple of them. And he was one of the first homosexual authors to bring this into his writings. In Giovanni's room, we see links between homosexuality and blackness. Now keep in mind, at the time, homosexuality is viewed in the United States as being inappropriate, as being impure, as being evil and dark. And we see comparisons to this in the book. When David, the main character, describes Joey, by the way, a European white man, he describes his body as being the black opening of a cavern open in the mind, black and full of dirty words. Clearly, then, Baldwin is making a connection between the way white America views homosexuality, just as white America views blackness. This continues into Baldwin's other works. His next work, A New Country, talks about the relationship between the black and the white community. We see, for example, heterosexual relationships which represent the way that the black community and the white community in the United States is in the 1950s and 1960s. It represents the violence in that relationship. But because it's heterosexual, it represents the way that America thinks that this can be. It's the only appropriate way for relations to be. If you contrast this with the homosexual relationships in the book, which are described as brotherly and peaceful and kind, this shows what James Baldwin thinks should be. That race relations can be kind and everyone can view each other as a brother. But importantly, because it's a homosexual relationship, it's not a relationship which is present in America at the time. And more importantly, it's not a relationship which white America views can happen or should happen.
Now, as an extension to the same work, Another Country, something else that Baldwin beautifully puts in this work is the inherent internal racism experienced by the African American community, the inherent frustration because of the white America's image of itself as innocent. Now, in Another Country, there is a character called Rufus, who is a black man who has a relationship with both a white female as well as a white male. But neither of these relationships are really born out of love or affection. They're born out of him trying to take power back from white America, and him trying to gain power over a white human being so that he can feel in control, so that he can feel that he's escaping the persecution levied upon him. And this kind of internal racism, this kind of need to struggle for power, is something that white America's image of innocence inevitably led to. And he further goes on to show the strength of this inherent frustration, the strength of this inherent racism, in how Rufus eventually commits suicide towards the beginning of the novel. Rufus's death, in many ways, is the death of the African American community in some ways in this book, because he basically shows that white America's image of innocence is not doing anyone any favors. It's in fact causing harm to the African American communities living in the ghettos, believing that this is the only way things can be. And this leads to frustration. This leads to death. Another beautiful portrayal of something in his works is that of queer masculinity in context of the African American struggle for freedom. Because at that time, as we've discussed previously, homosexuality, bisexuality, being queer in your sexual orientation was seen as dirty, was seen as unacceptable, and in many ways was seen as similar to being black. And this led to the people who are black and also of a different sexual orientation feeling an immense extra amount of persecution against them. And this was seen as the status quo at the time because of white America's image of itself as innocent. And so this dark underbelly full of inherent racism, full of internal frustrations, is what Baldwin sought to expose in his work, Another Country.
Now, we mentioned this debate a little bit before. On the right is Professor Paul Weiss, and he's exhibiting this white innocence. More importantly, this clip that we're about to show you is James Baldwin's response to Paul Weiss's assumption and assertion that there is nothing separating a black author from a white author, so much as there is separating a black scholar from a white scholar. He suggests that there's just as many struggles that white people have as black people. And those struggles are more important than race. And I think this is an important clip to show. We could just tell you his response, but let's take a look and see it.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only conclude what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know that white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know as Malcolm X once put it, the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That's a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence.
So, as we see, Baldwin is making the argument that everything is inherently wrong from the black community's perspective. It is their struggle, and the white community is ignoring it in what they claim to have white innocence and ignorance at the time. Eventually, Baldwin comes to the conclusion that a black man can never really become a man. His free will, his choices, his dignity is taken from him by the white community because they've decided all of this before him. They've limited his possibilities and they've controlled his future. And we can see this throughout a lot of the works that he's done. He tries to unveil this controlling method by comparing sexuality, by comparing characters to historical context. And in all of that time, he tries to argue that white America's self-image of everything being fine, that their offense to the civil rights activism and their confusion is ignorant, and they need to take a look at their parallels and what they have done. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. First day done, and all with hell freezing over outside. Okay. I'm going to go home.